Welcome to Women Entrepreneurs Radio with your host, Deborah Bailey. When I started this podcast in 2008, I was on a mission to promote women business owners, creatives, and entrepreneurs. In each episode, my guests provide resources, valuable tips, and inspiration. Women Entrepreneurs Radio is about showing women how to harness their natural strength to achieve success on their own terms. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Women Entrepreneurs Radio with your host, Deborah Bailey. I'm so glad you could join us today. And I'm going to introduce my guest, Jessica Hendry Nelson, and she's joining us to talk about her upcoming book, a memoir called Joy Rides Through the Tunnel of Grief, which includes essays on love, wonder, and the fierce bonds between women. And the book was the winner of the 2022 Sue William Silverman Prize in Creative Nonfiction from the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. And Jessica is an assistant professor in the MFA program and English department at Virginia Commonwealth University and on the faculty in the MFA program at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. So welcome to the show, Jessica.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you so much for having me. I
really want to just dive in to talk about your book and inspirations and everything. This is such an interesting title. Is very interesting, and that certainly caught my attention. Please share with us what inspired you to work on this book.
Well, I think this book, it was born out of a particular time in my life when I was 30. I guess I started this book when I was 33 years old, and I had been with my partner, Jack, for, almost 15 years at that point. And we had recent conversations where he had revealed to me that he actually, surprised, he didn't want to have children. And this was something that I hadn't come to any conclusions about, but there were questions. I was asking questions about it. And I had a lot of ambivalence about the questions of having children or not to have children. And of course, as a woman and, of a certain age, these questions start to take on more urgency when you wake up suddenly and you're nearing your mid-30s and, you start to feel pressure from family and society and yourself. And so, I was sort of struck and taken aback when something that had seemed like an open question suddenly became a foregone conclusion that this partner, the love of my life, who I had no intentions of, leaving or being without, told me something so final and decisive about, what he saw for his own journey. And so, I had to make a decision, and I knew that, that decision was not going to be a quick one. And, at that time I was also, and still am, and always have been, living with, a brother who has a really serious heroin addiction. And so, most of my life, all of my life, starting with my father, has been shaped and shadowed by addiction and the anticipatory grief that comes with addiction. And that grief is something that I was starting to see as a practice, that it wasn't just, something that I had to survive, but it was something that I had to move through in a way that was going to let me, I think, broach questions about, questions about wonder, questions about terror, questions about trauma, questions about making and sustaining a life inside of that grief. Like it wasn't going to go away, or I couldn't depend on it going away. My brother was relapsing repeatedly. He had, been in and out of jail and relapses and overdoses and unhoused for going on 20 years. And so I knew that couldn't control that. So all I could control is the way that I moved through that grief, which, started to take on something that felt more akin to my writing practice. So, so all of those, all of this was sort of coming together at a certain time in my life. So as I started to write essays about it. And these essays, they were questions, not answers. And I wanted to know, if I could take all of this creative urgency, and could I just make art? At that point I was already, a writer. I had published a book. I was working on a textbook. I was teaching, I had been teaching writing for 10 years. And I wanted to know if that was enough, if I could, live this life with my long-term partner as I had planned. And, we had just bought a little farmhouse in Vermont, and, would that be enough for this big love and this big wonder and all of this creative urgency? And so those essays started to take a shape. And at some point I had to concede that I was working on a book, that would then take me 7 more years. But, it became this beautiful space where I could bring in all of my research that I love to do, and I could take these questions to other writers, and see what other women had written about it, said about it, thought about it, feel about it, and make this collection of essays.
Well, it sounds like there was a lot going on in terms of emotion, because mentioning your brother and father, and then this relationship and coming to these realizations, did you feel a sense that there was something else about to end in your life? Because you're talking about grief and addiction and having to see someone that you love is going through these things and may possibly not survive something. And there's always that anticipation of something, happening that you cannot control. When it came down to finding out this, I guess, decision, I guess you could call it, from your partner, like, how did that, at that time, did you know that, okay, I don't think this is going to continue, or was that something that you really had to consider?
I think I really had to process it. And I think I knew deep down that one of the things I was grieving was this relationship, that for this reason and others, I think I sensed that we had flown our course, and that, of course, was difficult. He had been my partner since I was 18 years old, and through a lot of this family tumult, he had been a steadfast, he had been, solid ground for me for a long time. But it was really, I think for both of us, hindering our ability to evolve and flourish. And so, that took years though. I mean, it was a very slow and then very sudden, dissolution. And so, it was very emotional. So, I was always, and especially at that time, my brother's imminent death was always there. And so everything felt, more urgent because of that. I think, and then to take those questions that are, deeply emotional, but to turn them into what is also an intellectual inquiry, as much as it is a psychological and an emotional reckoning, that became, both, therapeutic, and also, how a good essay is made.
And as far as putting that on the page, like, how did that feel? Because that has to be very vulnerable.
It is and it isn't. I mean, people ask this a lot, especially students, like, how does it feel to write about such personal stuff? Right. And, this is my second memoir collection of essays. This is the genre that I write in most predominantly. And, what I've found over the years of doing this work is it's in some ways, it's less emotional than you might think. It's less vulnerable than you might think, because what you're doing is you're taking something deeply personal and turning it into, a piece of art, which means, a lot of problem solving. So you're taking this stuff that is, yes, emotional, but it now becomes a literary problem. It becomes a language problem. And that process in some ways takes it outside of you and turns it into something that you can really look at with some more distance. So, what might overwhelm you, personally, when you're working with that material, it becomes, really empowering, because it's not this thing that has control over you. It's this thing that you control. And so I found that, personal writing is actually, it doesn't overwhelm my psyche in the way that, it might feel like it would.
Yeah, I think that's what people think of, I think, in general, if they're talking about memoir, because then it's like, okay, I have to bear my soul and everything, and who's going to think this and who's going to say this, and what a family member is going to say, or what, that always seems to come up when people talk about this type of writing, that they're always, I guess, in some ways fearful of really saying what they really feel or really think.
I think there's two parts to that, right? Like there's always the personal repercussions and, what is my mother going to think, if I say this, if I write this, or how will my partner feel? As a teacher of writing, students, they want to know how that feels, how my family reacted, how my friends reacted. What they want to know is, how are their people going to react? And that is a truth that you can't avoid if you're going to do this work. It is not for the faint of heart, I'll tell you. So, what I try to tell them is, that's the part that you can't avoid. You can't sort of, there's no answer I can give them that's going to assuage them about that. I knew that, my family, in any case, was really open, as much as flawed as we are, and as screwed up as we are, we're also really open about that. And they sort of gifted me their stories when I started writing and publishing about, our experiences. They gave me their blessing and have continued to give me their blessing. And I think part of that is not because, there's a great, somebody has, oh God, who is it? I'll have to think of who said this, but Mary Carr said, people will, I think it was Mary Carr, that, if you write about people well, they're going to be flattered, not because you see them in the most, rose-colored light, but because you see them well, or you see them truly. And I think that's how, my family feels. But, there are lots of practical ways that, I go about it. I always give them this material ahead of time. I give them the option to talk through anything that feels contentious or untrue, or to offer a perspective that, I hadn't considered before. I don't promise to change anything before I publish it, but I promise them I will, listen to them and take their concerns seriously. And thankfully their concerns haven't been, that serious yet. I think that, you have to be, if you're doing this work well, you're being really generous to your people, to your characters, to your people, real people in your lives. And any writing, any personal writing that doesn't treat them generously, that's out of revenge, or vindication, or, whatever other, negative motives, the writing isn't going to be good. So it's not going to get published anyway. So you don't have to worry about it, right?
That's a good point.
So it's fine.
But were there times anyway that you may have had a different, let's say, a different recollection than maybe someone else did of an
Sure.
event?
Yeah, all the time. All the time. I mean, everybody's perspective it's all a construction, right? I mean, memory is its own form of creative nonfiction. So, everybody's memory is going to be shaded and shadowed by their own emotional experience of it and what they need that story to mean in any given moment, which will change over time and yada yada. So yeah, I mean, there have been plenty of times that we've disagreed on the logistics, but I think so far, and I'm speaking particularly of my mother, my brother, who I write about most often, but I think they understand that, my emotional experience is mine. And I try to make that clear in the writing too, that this is my experience of it. It's not everybody's experience.
Well, that's true. That's something that I think a lot of people don't consider. Sometimes if they may argue with someone else about what they think happened or how they interpret it, and it's almost like they don't really see that you're having a different experience than this other person did in the same situation.
Yeah. And, if you're going to write creative nonfiction, that's one of the key lessons, right, that I bring to my students is there is no capital T truth, though there's only this collection of little T truths, so, one element of craft that we talk about is how to allow for those other perspectives at times, while also making it clear that your perspective might differ, that these various perspectives can coexist and they can all be equally true. And can you represent that in the work, and if you can, that can be a pretty powerful craft strategy.
Well, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
It is, because that perception that person has is not something you can say, oh, that didn't happen or that's wrong. Is a lot of people love to tell people about things, but it's like, well, no, it's not wrong, and it did happen because it's their perspective. And yeah, I think that would be challenging for people to accept, who really need to see the world in this in the light of, well, what I see or how I saw it is the only way.
Right. And if if those are the people you're writing about, that's going to be hard. That's going to be harder for you, on a personal level. And, I try to remind my students that, these personal relationships, if they're important to you, it's not going to be worth that sentence, that paragraph, that essay, that book, that publication. It's just not, ultimately. Right. And so, then you have to really, do some self-examination and say, I feel really strongly that this happened this way, and I love this scene and it's brilliant writing. But maybe I have to let it go if I don't want to be disowned. So
that's true.
There are practical implications, which, by the way, exist in fiction writing too, because of course everybody's going to be scouring your novel for iterations of themselves. So, at least creative nonfiction is upfront about it.
That's true. A lot of people have hidden things inside their fiction.
Right.
Certain situations. So yeah, that's a good point, because they may think that that's safer, but it's not necessarily.
No.
Oh my God, that's a great point. So you went through this relationship transition, and now you're a new mom.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that this is like another world that you've stepped into now.
It is another world. Yeah. It's a very primordial world. I'm still, kind of feeling my way through the fog, but it's wonderful. I mean, isn't that what every new mother says? I'm so sleep deprived. I can't see. I can't think. I can't. But it's wonderful. And it is. And it is. And it is. I think we sort of default to that because you don't know what else to say about it in these early days. Language is lost to you. So you just say the most basic, blunt, and true thing you can think to say, which is, this is so hard and so great. Get back to me in a year and maybe I'll have a better reflection. Something more articulate to say about it. But right now,
it's so good. Well, I think that's also interesting because there was a time that mothers really didn't get the opportunity to say what they really felt.
No, I'll be saying a lot more about it, I'm sure. I have lots of unformed thoughts about motherhood so far and what it means to be a mother in this culture and society and time and place. But I'm going to need a little time to reflect and sleep. But maybe the next book.
Oh my God.
It was cool, Deb, because I worked on this book for 7 years. It was really the hardest thing I ever wrote. And it was a lot of, it was, losing that partner, that relationship was every bit a death as other big deaths that I've experienced and just as traumatic. And so, writing through that, and writing, so much about this desire to have a child. And then finally, the book is accepted for publication and, which takes a while, of course, it's like a year, 2 years after that. And I'm in a new relationship. And the day I go to take my author photo is the day I found out I was pregnant. So that was really cool. So every time I look at that picture, I remember, that's the day that I read that little plus sign on the stick.
That's fantastic timing.
It was good timing. It was very cool.
Oh my goodness. So it just sounds like when you're writing this kind of work that there's things you need to know in terms of how to express yourself on the page. Would you say that that's really the case for, someone who's listening who may not even really have an idea of how they would put something like this on the page,
Yeah. I mean, so, the craft of creative nonfiction is, in what I love about the craft of creative nonfiction is that it pulls from fiction writing, it pulls from poetry. The forms are so varied, the possibilities are so wide open. And so, to do this work is really, in some ways very similar to someone who's embarking on a path as a poet or a fiction writer, except, I think your arsenal is in some ways broader, your craft arsenal because, you're using some of the fiction techniques to make your scene work and you're using the lyricism and attention to language and image of poetry and even skills of a journalist, you're harnessing those, you're taking all of this, swath of creative practice that, you've done in other genres and now you're just telling true stories, so there's not much that, is different about that, except that you have this added layer of, maybe urgency and maybe relevance, and responsibility, to yourself and the people in your stories, to do this work well, the fictional characters, aren't going to have feelings about how you've depicted them on the page, but these people will. and often real, political implications. I think, telling true stories is maybe the most political act, whatever genre you're writing it in or making it in, whatever art, you're using to tell true stories. And so there's a lot of, I think, responsibility to that. So learning how to do that well is the similar to learning any creative practice, reading a lot, writing a lot. I wrote a whole textbook about, the craft of creative nonfiction, called Advanced Creative Nonfiction, a Writer's Guide. And, and so, there's a whole bevy of resources, and there's, many other, craft books about writing creative nonfiction. But yeah, if someone wants to, write their true stories, then there's whole schools that you can attend, programs and residencies and that sort of thing.
And I guess particularly after having written a textbook, then that puts a little bit of pressure.
Yeah. Well, the pressure is always there. I mean, the pressure is really my own, right? I mean, this is what I do, right? So I published my first book in 2014, and I'm a professor of creative writing, and so the pressure's really, the world isn't waiting, of course. The world is never waiting for anybody's art. We'll be just fine without it, but the personal pressure is right. Real.
Well, that's true, and I think that's why a lot of times people end up holding back when they should express something, because they may feel all these doubts and that they're not good enough, or they don't have anything to say, and and that's not really the case.
No, I mean, if anything, and I, of course, I see this from students all the time, but, patriarchy wants everybody to be silent, especially, people who have suffered. So, to tell our stories, is maybe the most, resistant thing we can do. Instead, it's easy to feel like your story is trite or overdone, or you should be ashamed of it. But I think we live in a society that would rather we not. And so, yeah, it's important. It's maybe the most important thing. If we're being responsible citizens, it's subversive to write about our trauma.
Well, that's true.
Right.
Also, what you're saying, there's also some social media platforms, the kind of influencer culture where everything is just so wonderful and
oh, yeah. It is. It's so hard and so wonderful.
You've got that, you've got to have everything looking a certain way and presented a certain way, but then you've got people wanting to tell their truths at the same time. And it's a contrast, I guess, maybe is what I'm looking to say.
It's a conflict of interest too. I mean, I think this is why, we have so many young people are so depressed, right? Like the rates of depression among, teenagers and young adults is skyrocketing, and in large part because of the influence of social media. So that's super dangerous and scary to me, especially as a new mother to a daughter. So, the more, and I, with my female students in particular, they're terrified of telling their stories. I think, a big part of that fear is because they've heard for so long that, memoir is not as rigorous as other forms of writing, or that their stories are, gauche, or that, we don't need another story about trauma or about, sexual assault or addiction or, feelings, or disempowerment, and, that writing this work is somehow dramatic or whining or attention grabbing or beating a dead horse. And, of course they hear those messages, right? Because nobody wants, these stories to get out, right? Because they upend the status quo. They challenge the status quo, to tell women that, personal writing is somehow less than, creating this false binary between, the emotional and the intellectual. If the emotional is female and the intellectual is male, and, we can subordinate, everything that's deemed emotional. And that's another way to keep our girls quiet, and people of color and queer kids and, everybody else who finds themselves disempowered.
Yeah. And that's definitely, a hot topic in the day and age of book banning.
Sure.
Don't call it banning.
Right.
Don't call it that.
Of course. No, don't say what it is.
Right.
How dare we do that?
It's like for people to express who they are, what they are feeling, because that then can help someone else who may be going through similar things or may, see something there that they see in themselves.
Totally. I mean, personal writing, particularly personal writing by women, saved my life when I was, a college student. I found this work and I didn't know it existed. And I thought it was the most radical, brilliant stuff I had ever come across, and that, these stories could be turned into art. Somebody cared about these stories, and I saw all of my experiences in that, the trauma, the growing up with it, an alcoholic father who died when I was 17 and, my brother who's addicted to heroin and, growing up with a single mother, all of that, narrative that, I was taught that, was just cliche and to get over it and you just, you move on. And then to see books that were so good. And by the way, they're so good, right? Like there's so many, I think this idea that personal writing is therefore mediocre, is so funny to me. Like, of course there are mediocre memoirs. There are mediocre poems, there are mediocre novels. But there's also really brilliant books of creative nonfiction. And so when I found that at 18, that was revolutionary to me. That was life-changing.
Yeah. And I think, obviously there's a lot more to be said. It's a lot more for people to express within themselves and let that out. And, as you said, there's the whole, status quo that tries to, tell people that your stories aren't important and you shouldn't express anything, and trying to give the negative connotation. But I think the more that people let that out, there's something more healthy about that than to be holding that in and then that becomes something else that's very negative.
Yeah. Well, that that could be destructive, right?
Right. Because when people aren't expressing, it's going to come out in some other way that may not, be really good for them or anybody else. So I think the whole making art really needs to be, I guess, in our culture, like respected more, taken more seriously.
Yeah, I think so, Deb. Yeah. I mean, I'm coming from, of course we know this, right? And we see in the schools, like the arts are the first programs to be cut and it still hasn't changed, we're still 2023 and, I'm at a university and, money gets hard. And of course, the first thing on the chopping block are all of the creative programs, and all of the artists and all of the writers are bracing themselves, for deep cuts. So, we know what our society values and what it doesn't. And, lest we forget, we'll be reminded. So
that's for sure. That's for sure. Yeah, they're going to make sure of that.
Right.
But it just seems like it's so life affirming, because it just really is a way for people to get what's inside of them out, in just self-expression or group expression or whatever.
Yeah. And, let me be clear, like, not everyone needs to write memoir in order to do that, nor
right.
should they.
Right.
There are many other outlets, so, but if you want to write memoir and publish it and have it be good, that there's a lot of work that goes into that. But of course there's other ways to get hard feelings out, and writing it, James Pennebaker did, this experiment, how many decades ago, right? So 15 minutes of expressive writing a day. In just 4 days, participants, had lower rates of depression, anxiety, so there's all sorts of, that was just one of the earliest studies. I think there've been others since then, but, it of course is a way for people to, process really tough experiences. But, writing and publishing, doing it well is another thing, right? But just doing it is important. Doing it in whatever capacity.
Right. And yeah, that's a good distinction. Because some people, they really need to just take out their journal.
Sure. Right. And there's and that's, nothing wrong with that. My God, I love to paint, but I would never try to sell that to anybody or show it to anybody for that matter. But, I know what my strengths and weaknesses are.
Well, you just get your AI and it'll do it for you.
Right. Which is scary to me. I'm sure it's scary to everybody, but I'd be curious to see what the AI would write about my life story.
Right? That's just a whole other thing.
That's a whole other thing. It might be pretty therapeutic to see how AI would tell your story. Or it might be, more traumatizing. I know.
It's hard to say right now.
The collective unconscious weighs in on your personal narrative. Let's see.
Oh my God.
Like an exposure therapy, maybe.
Yeah, I'm just picturing this. Might be an interesting experience, may not be.
Right.
It all depends, but yeah, that's another thing looming, over I guess everyone, but definitely creative people have made their thoughts.
Oh yeah.
No,
that's another conversation I'm not ready to have.
For sure. Yeah, it's very interesting, but it's also like, I guess part of the fact that there is, I don't know, to some degree, for those people who may not be creative, may not think of themselves as creative, or looking for ways to, we could just monetize this, kind of thing. It's almost like you're missing the point that when when human is going to express themselves in art, it's a whole different thing.
Oh yeah. 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 I mean, I'm sure there's a market for, AI penned, books, right? I mean, there's a market for most anything. So,
right.
Sure, but it's not the same, it's not
right.
It's not the art that a lot of us go to learn how to survive, to live.
Yes.
It's not that kind of life-giving art. It might be entertainment. It might be, a great distraction. I have no idea what it'll be. I don't want to know I don't want to speculate, but I'm sure someone will buy it and they'll monetize it and it can serve its own function. But,
Yeah, they're trying to find a way, that's for sure.
All right.
They're working on it right now.
They certainly are.
But yeah, it almost just to me highlights how important it is for the individual person to really, find those ways of self-expression. Because it just kind of shows how important that really is for people. And they may not even realize how important it is because it hasn't been emphasized to them, or, maybe they did want to express themselves and they're told not to do it, or, whatever stops people from doing it,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Fear, shame,
mm-hmm.
all sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, that's true, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And when it comes to as far as your students, when they're starting out in learning about this, are they really open to, diving in, or in this kind of internet world, do they have a different perspective as far as writing this kind of work when they, probably grew up seeing a lot of the online things in space and all that?
Yeah. I think I've been teaching in college, in higher ed for 15 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've seen these different, waves of students come through. And so I've been thinking a lot about the shifts that I've noticed. And I think actually it's made them it's given them a little more encouragement, in fact. I think at the very least, I think social media has made students more aware of the power of personal narrative, whether that's a TikTok story or an influencer. Now these, it's curated and it's glitzified and it's covered up. I don't, it's packaged in this way, but at least they're more accustomed to, personal stories as having value. And I think that a lot of them, because they're in a creative writing class, they're more interested in, authentic storytelling. So they've found, the pockets of the internet that support that. So in general, my students come into the classroom, more open to this work than, say, 10 years ago, when I think the shame of revealing anything personal, particularly for female students of color, queer kids, was so still, overwhelming, that the thought of, writing it on the page in an essay or a memoir, was terrifying. Like, and still, really mired in this idea that memoir was somehow less rigorous or intellectual than other kinds of writing. And so, nobody wanted to be seen as less intellectual, or God forbid, writing, publishing our diaries, which I don't know who is able to publish their diary. They must be really well connected. So, they were more resistant. And so, thankfully, if anything, this generation, I think, is more open and more self-accepting. Maybe that's part of it, at least, at the school where I am now, in this little city, which it's just a really diverse group of students, really cool kids. So, I think they're more open than students in my past.
Well, that's encouraging.
It is. I mean, I love Gen Z. I am very proud of them. I think they're doing a lot of hard work and, reckoning with things that previous generations just couldn't, for whatever reason. And so this group of this generation, by and large, really heartens me, and will tell their stories with, shocking vulnerability sometimes.
Yeah, I think, as you're saying that, a lot of, there's a lot more opportunity, I think, for people to express these things. And, social media is a part of that. And people, publishing, indie publishing and
Yeah.
making their own, films and making this and that, and not necessarily having to go through, established body to do
Right.
that.
Right.
Because you couldn't, you may have wanted to make little movies, but you're going to be on like Access Cable or
Right.
something. You're not going to put it out to the world.
Right.
So it's there's a totally different way of looking at things because they didn't have that same, I guess, limitation.
That's exactly, yeah, I think you're
Yeah,
exactly right. The
that's a good
monolith
point.
was really, the gatekeepers were doing
Mm-hmm.
their job. And so,
Mm-hmm.
keeping all the riffraff out. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so, one good thing that's come out of the internet age, I think, is the way that all these other possibilities for making and sharing art have emerged. And yeah, I think my students, I think Gen Z, I think, young people and old people for that matter, are suddenly, feeling empowered, feeling like there's a place for their work because they're seeing it, they're seeing it out there. It exists. And that's wonderful.
Exactly. That's the great thing about it. People are being seen, and then that encourages other people. So that's the kind of thing that we need to overcome other people who are trying to draw, things back in to a place where they felt more comfortable. And
right.
Yeah, that's not the way to go. I'll say about that.
Just not the way to go.
No, it's just. Yep, that's what I'll say about that.
Right.
But Jessica, could you please share where the listeners can find you or find out more about you?
Sure. So my website is jessicahNelson.com, and I'm on Instagram, jhnelson427, I think is my handle, and Facebook, same thing. And yeah, that's where you can find me.
Great. And your book is coming out in the fall?
September 1st. It's coming out, Joy Rides Through the Tunnel of Grief. And yeah, from UGA Press. And yeah, I'll be doing readings and events and stuff like that in the fall, as much as I can do with a newborn. It's going to be an interesting season.
True, because you're going to be busy.
I don't know how I'm getting very good at like breastfeeding with one hand and, working with the other.
Well, that's definitely going to be an interesting book that you'll be working on. So we can hear more about that experience.
That'll be the next one.
So you can share all of this with us.
Yeah, I will. I'll be back.
I'd love to have an update. We definitely had a great conversation. I know we could just go on.
It was really fun, Deb. It was great talking to you.
So, as we wind it up, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Keep telling your stories.
That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
Right now, I think.
I was just, I was reading this interview with the writer Garth Greenwell, who is a fiction writer primarily. I read his novel, What Belongs to You. I think that came out a few years ago. Beautiful book. But I was thinking also about wonder. I write a lot about wonder. My book is a lot about wonder, and also joy and happiness. And, I think another fear that writers have is that if they're happy, they suddenly won't have anything to write about. And so I just read this quote that I'll just share because you asked for final thoughts, and this is what I was thinking about. But Greenwell said, it's an aesthetic failing, but also a moral one, to see happiness, even very ordinary happiness, as somehow less profound, variegated, interesting, less accommodating of insight than other kinds of experience. And I just thought, what a beautiful, true, thing to say, that we're so, as much as it's important to write about our stories of trauma and our stories of grief, it's also so important that, we talk about really ordinary happiness. And, I've been thinking about that a lot too, as a new mother, as I sort of sink into this place of real happiness, and how do you write about that? It's a challenge for a creative person, but I think a really important one. So I'll just share that as a final thought.
Well, I love it, because that's even that's another issue. A lot of times people are told, they've got to add more trauma, or they have to add more conflict in their lives because they may be from a marginalized group, because that's kind of an expectation that
right.
you can be a lot of suffering.
Right.
And people just may want to write about this happy thing, or all of life all day long is not suffering. So why can't they also express the things that bring them joy and happiness too?
Right. All of that is important. So I just had that conversation with a colleague who was saying, that she felt pressured to write a trauma narrative, because she is Sri Lankan and grew up in war. And so that's, that's this marketable thing now. Right. So, and she doesn't want to write that book, and shouldn't have to, and doesn't have to. So, so it's an important thing to keep in mind too.
Yes. So I'm so glad you shared that quote with us, because I think that's also, a good thing for anyone listening who is considering expressing themselves, and to know that, they do have choices how they do that. So
write me a beautiful book about a good day. That's right. And that, I want to read that book, right? And it'll contain, all of the nuance and all of the insight, that a trauma narrative can contain, if you do it well.
Right. That's true. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a joy. I appreciate it. It was really a joy.
Yes, I enjoyed it too. So thank you so much.
Okay.
So everyone, I know you enjoyed the show, so please make sure you share this on social media, and check out Jessica's book and her other books, and check out her website, and definitely let your friends know to listen in. So once again, it's been Women Entrepreneurs Radio with your host, Deborah Bailey. So glad you could join us, and we will see you again next time. Bye-bye.